to kick off because maybe I won't finish in time. But welcome to Troubleshooting Power BI Reports. I assume you're all here because all of your Power BI reports are working perfectly fine all the time.
Yep.
Okay, yeah, I heard a yeah, so that's great. Perfect, session done. So this is a collection of the things that I run into when I work with customers, when I look at their reports. It is the it depends show, basically. There's no silver bullet. There is plenty of different variables that can influence all of the occurrences. The key thing you need to remember is test what you're doing and benchmark it as opposed to what you're expecting. That's the key thing. But myself, I work for a small software company called Microsoft. They're based in Seattle, and I work in a team that has a very resemblance to felines called cats. It is short for Customer Advisory Team. The essence is we work with customers, we listen to them, and what they've told us, we try to take back to the product group. I help run a user group called datamines.be. It's the Belgian version. We put on a conference, user group sessions, bringing people together that want to talk data, in essence. If you want to find me afterwards, I always use the same handle. If you know how to spell my name, you will be able to find me. Most of the occasions, if you do the first name correctly, with the I instead of the epsilon, that'll make it very easy for you to find me. I'm also not overly fond of pie charts. I'll just put that out there. But what do I want you to take away from this? Well, I want you to make sure that you know what's available for you to pinpoint some of the common causes. I want you to look at a few techniques on how you can avoid or even solve some of these common problems. And in the end, it's always about a usable set of best practices. Always, always. But it's not a DAX or a Power Query Performance deep dive. I'm going on the layer that's in front of that people always forget about. But it depends. Sorry, it depends. So why do you want to troubleshoot your reports? Well, no one likes to wait. People get antsy if they have to wait for more than 5 seconds, basically. If a report's not loading in 5 seconds, that's even stretching it, people are getting annoyed. They want things to go fast. And it is also, well, works on my machine, coming from the report developer, is a horrible reply. It's a horrible, horrible, horrible answer. It means that usually the developer has a big, beefy machine, a good laptop, everything's working fine on them. But then if they go to the end user that has maybe a less performant machine, or they got network conditions, there's all sorts of things at play. And if you then go ahead and say, well, it works on my machine, that's usually not going to cut it. But it boils down to what's the context and what's the baseline. Are you reporting on an Excel file with 1,000 records in there? Or is this connecting to your SAP BW system with billions of records in it? Do people expect the report to render in 2 seconds, or have you agreed on your non-functional agreements, in non-functional requirements, that 10 seconds is more than okay? What's the context? What's the baseline? What are the expectations? And typically when I get sent off on these assignments, I always go for quick wins. Quick wins, what can I do easily that can alleviate some of the issues and gain trust? Because like any of the assignments, it is always about trust that people have towards you. Whether you're a consultant, whether you're working for Microsoft, whether you're working internally, it's always about trust and getting the trust from the people that want you to do these things for them. I typically don't go into these long investigations on reports that are barely ever used unless it's C-level. Because C-level has the budget and they typically sign off on that budget too. So if they ask for something, the majority of the times that's what they're going to get. And it boils down to, well, a magical formula. It's a combination of science, art, and luck. Knowing what to do, having a certain flair, and luck. Why do I say luck? I want to make it very clear, you cannot know everything. Using the search engine of choice, Bing, is always a valid pattern. You cannot know everything. Please make sure that you take this away from the session. But it depends. I'll repeat that a couple of times, by the way. But before I start, I want you to know one thing. It is, well, a concept called noisy neighbors. It's something that I want you to understand. Power BI, whether you're using it in all the shapes and forms there is always going to be some form of sharing resources, sharing bandwidth with other people, whether they are in your own organization or whether they are in other organizations. So you will never ever get the exact same results in terms of performance benchmarking ever, even up to the milliseconds. There's always going to be some difference. Sometimes it can be in your favor, sometimes it won't be in your favor. But it's a concept to be very aware of. And if you're that in a service, and you're using Power BI Pro, that means that you're running on shared capacity. It's resources that are there for every other organization in that region. We manage everything for you, but it means that, let's say it's a very busy season, it's financial closing in all the companies at the same time, well, there is a small chance that you'll have a performance penalty for that. It's small, but it's there sometimes. And then when we introduced Power BI Premium, the first generation, the first wave, where you actually had a machine that was reserved for you somewhere in the magical data centers, people thought that it was going to solve all the performance issues. Sorry, not the question. You had to think, the admins had to think about what's happening when, spread out refreshes, spread out all the things they had to think about these things. And then when we moved to Gen 2, it was a big improvement. There's lots of things that improved, but it's still not a one fix for everything. There's still some work you have to do to get everything to work smooth and seamless. You don't get great performance for big reports and big user bases by default. As much as you want to, you'll always have to do a little bit of extra. And then you have to think about caching mechanisms. Caches are everywhere. On the visuals, on your queries, on the data source, on the result sets. Caching happens on all different places. So when you're looking into these troubleshooting mechanisms and you're comparing results of multiple runs, you probably have some form of caching happening somewhere. And you cannot influence all of them. So it is something you need to be aware of. But I want to show you the beautiful report that I've built. And I'm so glad that Reed's no longer in the room, because it's not the prettiest report that I've built in my life. I've done the report I've done a few things wrong for a few reasons, and the design unfortunately got pulled to the back. But the data is based on bikes. I come from the city of Antwerp in Belgium, where we have these things called vélos, which is French for bike, basically. I asked for the data, they wouldn't give it to me. So I went to my friend Bing, and it gave me the same thing for the city of New York. They gave me access to raw data. Okay, it's in CSV files in Amazon S3 buckets, but it is raw data to the transaction level, and it's many more. It is, I think right now, starting from June 2013, I'm at about 185 million transactions, which is a great data set for playing around with things, for testing a few things. It's a pretty good use case, it's a pretty good data set to play around with. But let me show you the report. The report itself is, as I said, I'm going to make some room here, not the prettiest report I've made, but it's there for a few reasons. It was extra slow today. You're seeing a few things here. You're seeing a few things that are not rendering the way they should be. And that's where we're going on right now. We're going on a journey to solve some of these things, to make sure that we can get the report to run a lot faster. But also notice this little guy that's still there, and I'm not going to wait for it, in all fairness. I'm going to close off this report and go back to the slides, because there is one thing I need to do before I actually dive in. There's lots of things happening inside of Power BI Desktop. Many people think it's just this executable that you execute on your local machine. But there's lots of different things happening there. For instance, if you open up Task Manager and you go look at a few of these things that are in there, there's a lot of things happening. They all eat CPU consumption. They all have memory footprints. The one thing is, you're probably looking at Power BI Desktop, which is the actual the actual application, the canvas where you interact with, you're probably seeing Microsoft SQL Server Analysis Services, which is a virtual instance of analysis services running on your local machine. It gets created when you close Power BI Desktop, it's get destroyed. You're also seeing mashup evaluation containers. It's for Power Query. It's the processes that actually transform that data and make it available in your analysis services model. And then a bunch of other background processes that are now contained in the new thing called WebView 2, which I'm not going to dive into too much right now. But there's lots of things happening, and many people are not aware of this thing. And remember when I said, works on my machine is the shittiest reply ever? Well, this is one of those reasons. The hardware that you're using is going to have a very big impact on what you're seeing here. But when I need to go troubleshoot reports, well, I've got a few tools that I can use for. A few tools that are always going to use for what I need to do when I troubleshoot reports. The first one is coffee. I don't work without coffee, sorry. That's the thing. But typically I look at a few tools, many different ones are there, and they help me for certain cases. The reality is that about 95% of the cases, I can stick to these. I can stick to the top 4. Depending on where I need to go, well, there's a lot of open source community tools out there, some of them even paid tools that can drastically help you. Slides are available afterwards, by the way, and there are links, so you can get to all of them. And they help me make those decisions. But the first one, that's the one that's built into Power BI Desktop. That's the Power BI Performance Analyzer Pane. We introduced that back in 2019. The first version was a bit, yeah, it was good, but it wasn't completely there yet. It is the flight recorder for what's happening in your Power BI Desktop. As soon as you tell it to start, it's going to log every single action in there. And every single action and how much time that is taking into different bits and pieces. And it is the key tool to use if you want to go look at something and how it's performing. It comes into Power BI Desktop by default ever since 2019. And if you're in 2023 and you're running a version that is older than 2019, you probably have other issues where you need to go update a few things. But if I go back into that file, I've landed on that same file on this page, on a blank page. I've closed the other file and I've opened up a new file. Why do I do that? It's because caching. The second I open up a report, it starts rendering. It's going to start doing all these operations before I can turn on the Performance Analyzer Pane. So step 1, if you want to do the Performance Analyzer Pane, if you want to use it, create a blank page, save your file, close it, open it on the blank page, and then start up with Performance Analyzer. The way that you do that is we make it extra confusing for you. There's now 2 options. Either you go down into the View pane, the View tab, and then it's the Performance Analyzer. Or if you're running a version later than November 2022, we also have it now in the Optimize ribbon. The button does the exact same thing. It's just there to mess with people's heads. That's what I'm told. So the second you say start recording, now everything that I'm going to do will get recorded. For instance, if I go into the main view, we're going to see some things happening. Lots of things on there. And a few things here that I want to talk about. A few of the topics that are going to be really important for you. Because I'm seeing numbers for all of these. I'm seeing numbers up to 3 seconds, and then that matrix that's still going on. Typically, depending on where I am, it'll go for 45 to 55 seconds. But I'm also seeing a lot of these shapes, and that's what we need to get back to later. For instance, if I open up a card here, there's a few things I can see. I know that this measure is a basic sum. It's a very basic sum of the data that I have right now. So on its own, that DAX measure isn't that bad. But what I'm seeing is I have this other time of 2.4 seconds, 2,400 milliseconds. It's in the other category. The gist of it is that it's waiting for other operations to finish. Power BI renders sequentially. It does one operation at a time, and it does some sort of a round robin across all the different visuals that are on there. So the other, if you see high other times, it usually means that you have a lot of things on the visuals, on the canvas. And why, particularly, that I see this very often, is because not a lot of people realize that, for instance, all these shapes, well, they're also eating up time. This shape, for instance, is taking 138 milliseconds and then 111 seconds waiting. Everything that's visible on the canvas needs to get rendered, will be an operation that needs to be done in that sequential way. So the high other time is typically a lot of visuals, a lot of shapes, text boxes, lines, rectangles, all of these things on a single piece of canvas. Why am I saying visible? Is that Power BI only starts to render things when they are visible. One thing, when they are visible, means that it's with the physical property of hidden yes, no. Drawing a white rectangle over it and hiding it, that doesn't work. I've had people actually try that. If the property is set to not hidden, that's when it gets rendered. So the first thing is, well, what do I do with these shapes? And typically, when I have people that don't believe me when these shapes have a big impact, I've now clicked on the Fun with Shapes tab, and it's now going to try rendering a bunch of shapes. What you'll see is that the shapes itself, the canvas, took about 3.5, 4 seconds to render just these shapes. There's not a single record of data on there. It's just only shapes. And this is drastically exaggerating, I know, but it is the impact that a lot of these shapes have. So what then do you do with these things? Well, there's varying opinions. The minimalists will say, just don't use shape. The designers will say, yes, but we need these things to be in containers, and we need these things to be set apart from each other. We need white spaces, etc. The reality is, probably you'll have better results purely for performance if you create a background image in PowerPoint, Figma, Paint, whatever your designer tool is, and use that as a single background image instead of many individual little shapes, rectangles, text boxes, lines. It can be cumbersome, I'll admit, but purely for performance, it can have a very big impact. So yes, if I just go ahead and now reduce this clutter, if I would close and open up the file, I'd have two things. In my opinion, it's less busy and will give me less of a headache, but it will also render a lot quicker. This will cut the most of the visuals down with about a second, just by removing those shapes on there. But I'm not done yet. There's still work to be done. The other thing, and I'm hoping I can stop moaning on about this one soon, is we've got these little individual card visuals. There's about 17 of them on there. 17 individual visuals that all require data to be collected from your data source, either whether it be your imported model or direct query to the data source. They're all going to use queries. They all need to be rendered individually. And this is a common pattern that I see. Individual card visuals. And the concept here is consolidate those visuals. Reduce the number of queries that are needed to actually get the data displayed on your canvas. Right now, it's a bit of a, what type of technique do you use, and is it acceptable for your business users? If you've not seen it, my colleague Miguel Myers is working on this big, very big strategic project called the Future of Power BI Visuals, and he's introducing a card visual that's going to have multiple cards in one container that are actually formatable, which is pretty cool. I've seen some demos of it, and he had me, well, I had to make sure that I was still sitting on my chair. It's going to be a lot easier for design purposes, maintenance purposes, but also for performance. Because right now, as I said, that's 17, at least, 17 queries, 17 rendering operations. So how do you alleviate some of these things? Well, that's why I said there's multiple opinions. one of the things you could do is make them into a table and play around with the formatting a bit. It's not I haven't gone all the way in making it exactly like a card visual, but it does reduce the numbers of queries that you have. This is where you'll need to have a debate with your end users. What's acceptable for them on a design purpose, and how far are you willing to go? Purely for getting the rendering time down, this is another significant step. But then, I want to tackle this little buddy. You've seen it take about 55 seconds to render. I just call this the table of doom. The sole purpose of this thing is that people want to click the export to Excel button. That's why it's there. I see a few people smiling. I see a few tears here and there. That's how I know that I'm hitting the spot. In my personal opinion, big, detailed tables have zero place in Power BI. Power BI is a data visualization tool. If you want big, flat tables, look at formatted tables, look at paginated reports, look at Analyze in Excel, look at Connecting in Excel. Those are tools that are more equipped for these big, flat tables with data in them. In Power BI, they have very little use because, I mean, it's way too detailed and no one can actually ever consume the data that's in here. And as I said, if the sole purpose is exporting it to Excel, why does it need to be on a page that's probably going to get consumed multiple times? It's only going to drag down the performance of the entire report that you're seeing. So, well, the quick and dirty option is reducing the granularity that you have in there, but you could also work with navigations, going into a separate page to have that table in an exportable format, doing drill downs to allow people to get into the level of detail. There's multiple options, and there's no silver bullet. It's going to come down to what you agree on with your end users and what's acceptable for them. That's going to be the key thing here. Here, I just went with the quick and dirty option to reduce the granularity. And that table now rendered in a few seconds. I went from the day level to a very much higher level. Usually, when you have data reporting over multiple months and multiple years, granularity up until the day level has very little use. It's a concept of data visualization where images tell a lot more than actually those big flat tables. Now, the one that I run into very often is these filters. Remember when I said that everything that gets put on the canvas needs to be rendered? Well, these filters are exactly the same thing, especially the ones that you see on the right side. They're going to display all of the values. And this is now, I mean, the right one has 3 values and the other one has also 3 values. So it's not a big query, but it needs to send a query, it needs to get a query running to retrieve those results. That's all going to happen the second that your end user opens up the report. Does it have value that that slicer is instantly there or there from the first time? Because most of the people I know, they're going to look at graphs first instead of what's in the slicer. So does that need to be rendered instantly when the page comes up? The answer usually is no. But how do you do this? Well, again, this is where controversy can exist. There's options. Either you change those filters to become a drop-down so that they need to click it open and then select the results. That way, the query will only be executed when they open up the drop-down. The other alternative, for instance, is moving it to the filter pane instead of slicers on your canvas. Some people are fans of the filter pane, some people are not. What's acceptable for your end users, talk about this, and then make sure that you have that agreement. But again, taking off these queries that get there on the report itself from the very beginning when it gets opened is again a little step that can get you far. But I'm not there yet, because the other one I want to show you is actually the map. And maps are, well, they can be interesting. They show you a lot of value. They show you insights into where it's actually happening. And for example, I have zero knowledge about how New York actually looks, how I need to orient myself. I've never been there, so I don't know. But this means that all of those little dots on there, the circles, they're all individual objects that get rendered one by one by one by one by one by one by one. And there's about 400 of them. Is this efficient? Probably not. Is it required? Depends on your user requirements. But these 400 individual objects, maybe they'll have an impact when you open up that report for the first time that you can avoid. And the topic of mapping is a very dense topic on its own. But for instance, consider changing that to a heat map. Instead of having the actual dots on there, this is going to be a lot more performant. It's going to eat up a lot less queries and a lot less rendering time. So with a few simple actions, that report, if I were to close it down and open it up again, going from 55 to 60 seconds would now be in 4 to 5 seconds. Is that a place where I can stop and rest? No, there's probably other things that I can still go ahead and fix. But in reality, those are things that are going to cost me 10 to 15 minutes, and you'll see a big impact on that report. And why do I tell these things? Well, I see a lot of people that have a tendency to say, oh, this report is slow. I need to go solve DAX. Why solve DAX if you can do a few of these tweaks first? Same thing with the model. You don't always have to jump into the code from the very beginning. There's other things on the top level that you can easily look at. But let me keep this open because I need it later. There we go. Let me go back into the slides. In the end, as I said, it all boils down to some tips and best practices. How are we doing for time?
You've still got a while to go.
20 minutes. Okay, good. Just sanity checking for myself. In the end, it all boils down to a lot of tips and best practices. My grandmother has a saying in Flemish, it's better to prevent than to have to cure afterwards. So putting some thought into how you design your reports, not only for the visual aspect, but also for the usable and the performance aspect, can save you a lot of effort afterwards. Because typically it's easier to go make some tweaks and changes to a report when it's not already in production and when it's not already used by different people. Because the second you're going to change anything that's in production is going to change behavior for people, you're in for a fun ride. Because not everyone likes change, which is a natural thing. But the things I see typically in these reports, not just related to those report sites, but when we go ahead and talk a bit more about the model and about your transformations. Well, what I see is that transformations are done late in the process. And what I mean with this is that you should always consider to make your transformations as early as you possibly can, but also only once. It makes zero sense to have a date being transformed into the integer format, for instance, in your data warehouse, only to cast that back into a date time again in your Power Query, for instance, or in a calculated column. It makes zero sense because you're doing double work. And I see that happening a lot, but also just a bit of the sensible thing. But these were the rules that I've been using before I actually had Matthew Roach's maxim. He's my colleague on the CAT team, and he explains it as data should be transformed as far upstream as possible and as far downstream as necessary. That means if you can do it in data warehouse, data lake, in views there, excellent. Do it in Power Query, that's okay. If you can, do not do it in DAX, in calculated columns or calculated tables. Well, the reason for that is, if you do it in DAX, it's going to be at runtime for every single user. If you have 50 users, that's 50 times that needs to happen at runtime, instead of once when you're refreshing your model, for instance, in import mode. Or if you're doing a data query scenario, if you persist that in the view, that also need to happen once. It's preventing double work. And it makes sense. And I do understand that not every one of us gets access to the data warehouse to make changes to the model, to the table structures. I understand. If you can use views on the database, on the data warehouse, on the lake, and persist them, this will always be the better solution purely for performance and typically manageability. If you can't, okay, Power Query is a great solution as well. But try to make sure that you follow some of those best practices too. But then I've had massive discussions about data types. It's 2023, why do data types still matter? They still matter. They still have a very big impact. The impact is, it's going to have a large impact on the size of your model. That is one thing. But the impact is also when the calculations need to happen. That's also a thing. But the discussions that I've had with plenty of people was with the data types we used to refer to as double and currency. Fixed decimal versus decimal. In a nutshell, fixed decimal translates to an integer under the covers. A decimal doesn't. So if you go into the engine internals, a fixed decimal is going to use run length encoding, so no additional dictionary, where a decimal needs to have that extra hash dictionary. So it needs to have an extra step to be able to work its VertiPack magic. And then what's better? It's, again, the discussion. But also, I've had plenty of discussions about decimal numbers and then the precision and the scale. Typically with finance people, do they really need 6 points after the decimal? 6 numbers after the decimal? To have that billion record table come up to the 6th point of decimal? Do they really need that? Well, why does this make a difference is because there's going to be multiple unique values in there. And it's going to not be able to compress as well as when you reduce those unique values. And then do you really need your date and time combined? Is that really needed? Is that really necessary? For the same reason. The VertiPack engine compresses on unique values. The more you can reduce those unique values, the better it's going to be able to do its magic. And in 98% of the cases, people don't need date time combined into one single field. It's perfectly acceptable to split it into a date field and into a time field. It's going to work well because you can compress the data very well and actually gain some of that performance optimizations. If you don't do it, well, it's still going to do its best, but it's going to be less efficient. But then, I've arrived at my dear friend called auto-date time. Auto-date time is a fantastic feature. It's a feature that exists in Power BI Desktop where it's going to take every field that's in your Power BI file that's labeled as a date or date time and automatically generate a calculated table in DAX for this. It's going to take the min and the max for every date field that you have in there. And I love it. If you're a new user getting started with Power BI that's hooking up their first Excel file. Nope, all right, okay, still. If you're a bit more advanced into things, well, I'm not as big of a fan of it. It's enabled by default, which means that for many people, they simply look over it. Let me tell you a story. I've been working with a customer with ERP data, dynamics, basically. And they were trying to get a table from AX loaded into Power BI. It had about 160 date fields in that table, and the minimum value was January 1st, well, the value if it was unknown, if there should be a date but they don't know what the date is, January 1st, 1900. If it was a date that was to be determined, they set it to January 1st, 2100, so 200 years. Well, there's 100 and, let's say, 60 date values in there, 200 years. So that means 160 generated calculated tables in your memory. They were having issues getting that table loaded into a Power BI Pro workspace because it was exceeding the 1 gigabyte limit that you have for Power BI Pro. The file size, I checked with DAX Studio, was about 8.5 gigabytes. Remember when I said quick wins? I turned off the toggle for auto date time, closed the file, opened it back up again. We were at 600 megabytes. Excellent. Quick win. They were so happy. They were able to publish it. There were still some other things to fix, but that immediately got them to be able to get it to work. So the thing is, it's one of the first things I check when I need to look at a model. Is auto date time still enabled? Because most of the times, you don't need it. And if you're doing a bit more advanced, you're better off using an actual date table. But then, it's also about the column and the row usage, or the Maricondo approach. Do you need everything that's in the model? Business users are going to say, yes, I need everything. I want all the data, I want it now. If I go back to that example for AX, do I really need those 160 date fields in there? No, because they're only working on 3 different fields. And there were a lot of other things in there that had 0 usage for them. So only loading in the columns that you actually need is going to be very beneficial. It's going to make sure that your refresh time is a lot faster. But also, the queries that you're doing are going to be more efficient because you're reading less data, especially if you're connecting to the types of data sources that bill you by the volume read, the snowflakes, the BigQueries, etc. Well, you're going to pay a lot of money that you don't need to spend. So, do you really need all that data in there? Only loading the data that you actually need. And then the same thing for those rows. Do you really need 10 years of historical data in a report that's designed for current analysis, 1 year only? How much value does that bring? Usually it's not that much. So it's something you really need to keep an eye on. But then, I mean, a lot of the things I run into is always related about data modeling. And I can summarize this into one slide. Star schema, all the things. Power BI is designed to work with star schemas. It thrives on it. The engine, the internal engine, can do the best of its work when you model it as an actual star schema. It is truly beneficial. And I've got a quick example to show you exactly why I mean that the star schema is truly beneficial for this. But I'll actually just go ahead and show you that right now. There we go. I forgot to open it beforehand. So I have a collection of this resolution. I have a collection of CSV files, which is about 31, let's round up, 31 gigabytes. That's one file, one big flat table, 31 gigabytes. I'll walk you through the steps when I'm creating that dimensional model to show you why it actually makes a difference. Well, I've got the direct query version, which is not that relevant right now. The base version is 4.4 gigs. That's persisted to file. It's not the actual dataset file size, but it paints a picture. 31 to 4.4. Simply by loading it into Power BI and letting Power BI compress data, look for unique values. Okay, next step, I'll make data types, because in that first step, I removed the detect data types changes. Everything was loaded in there as a string, everything. When I set those data types, decimals, integers, date values, we're going down a big step again. We're down to 3.8, which is a very good thing already. Then if I remove my dear friend auto date time, I'm going down to 2.5. Still no rocket science here. Still fairly simple things. Then if I throw out the columns that I actually don't need, I'm going down to 1.75, coming from 31. But when I go to a star schema, this is where the big difference is happening. I'm going down to 840 megabytes, roughly, coming from that 31 in the beginning and the 4.4. So why does that star schema make a difference? Well, the essence is, if the model is smaller, thank you, if the model is smaller, well, it has to do less work to find the data it needs. Less work typically means faster results. So you're helping the engine work its magic. But I'm not stopping there. Well, I wanted to also give you a quick example of why calculated columns can sometimes be not as efficient, because all I did was do a calculated column that simply does a, I think I took the duration in minutes, and then, the other way around. The duration in seconds, and then divided that by 60 to go into minutes in a calculated column. It's a quick and dirty approach. I'm just doing it there because that's the easiest. I can just do it in Power BI, and it's easy. The reality is, it took my refresh time, and it added another 20 minutes to it, just for that one column, and it makes it a lot bigger as well. So it impacts the refresh time, it impacts the model size, and it also impacts your performance. Because those calculated columns are, well, they're processed a bit differently, and they don't have the full benefits. Let me keep it at that. But then, well, if I go to the unused rows, as I said, I'm only reporting on the last 2 years. So I'm only loading the last 2 years instead of everything from 2013 on. 200 megabytes. Why do star schemas matter? That's why. And it's as I said, it's a very common discussion that I have with customers is, well, why do I need to do a star schema? It's those two old farts called Kimball and Inman that used to be talking about this in the 80s. Yes, but it's still very relevant. Purely for the internals, but in my personal opinion, also for people consuming that model and building stuff off it. Having those big flat tables with 95 fields in there, or having fact tables and dimensions with central themes, helps them find the right information. A lot of benefits. Is it easy to create star schemas? No, not always. It's not always an easy thing, but it does pay off. But if I go back into these slides, I'll zoom out again. It means it boils down to a few of these tips. And, well, the persistent surrogate key things, why do I put that in there, is I've seen people do index functions in DAX calculated columns and use that as surrogate keys to build the relationships on. It's not exactly the same thing. Is a GUID better than an integer? Yes, purely for size, but query performance will not be that big of a difference. I've had many a discussion with our Italian friends, Alberto and Marco, about this. Purely on the query results, it doesn't have that big of an impact. It's purely the philosophical reasons, let's say. Bidirectional filtering is, usually you don't need this. It adds confusion to your end users because it can influence results that you're not expecting it. If you need the relationship to work in 2 directions, you probably are better off using the cross-filter function. Auto-date time is something we don't want. If you're used to Power BI, if you know a few of the things, if you know how it works, try to avoid auto-date time. Role-playing dimensions, having a date dimension as order date, ship date, production date, for instance, it's a philosophical discussion that can go on for days. Debate that internally, debate that with your customer, with your end user, what they prefer. Purely performance-wise, it's storing data versus doing something in DAX, benchmark it, and debate it. But the data types, the precision and the scale, they'll play a very big role. But I'll skip this thing, sorry. What I also want you to what I also want to show you is, remember when I said works on my machine is a horrible, horrible answer? This is the reason why. My colleague on the CAT team, Chris Hamill, he did an experiment back in, I think it's 2019 or something. He did an experiment where he uses the exact same machine, the exact same model, the exact same report, and opens it using 2 different browsers. One, at the time, was Edge Dev, which had the Chromium kernel, and the other one was Edge, which did not have that at the point in time. The difference is, report 1 on the left side is done within, is done within 10 seconds, 10, 11 seconds. The other one takes about 30 seconds to complete. Same conditions, different browser. The browser, the machine, the network, all of these things from the end user can play a very, very, very big impact. It does play a role, so please do keep this in mind. So, if I try to summarize this, there's a few things. It means that, it's my idea, my personal opinion, that a lot of the things for report performance are easier to think about when you're still designing, when you're still testing and experimenting, instead of releasing it into the wild and having a bunch of end users already used to this. It also means that you need to think about your transformations, where they're happening, when and how. And modeling is very crucial. The star schema has very good results with Power BI because of the way that the engine can do its work. And then don't forget the end user. They have circumstances. They have network, machine, operating system, all different sorts of things that can have a big impact. The one thing that I didn't show you, because I babbled on for a bit too long, is that when you're using Tabular Editor, for instance, you can use something called the Best Practice Analyzer. And you can release that over your model and instantly get an overview of how your model is scoring on a listed set of best practices with the click of the button. If you want to learn more about that, come find me afterwards or go talk to them on the booth. You can do that in the paid version, but it also works perfectly fine in the free online community version. So you don't need the paid version for that. But then, I mean, you're here. It's a Saturday. You're learning from this Belgian guy that keeps rambling on. Keep reading things. Keep learning new things. That's going to be very good for you. We've also got a lot of excellent documentation on the Power BI docs page. A lot of our CAT team colleagues have been pouring their heart and soul into these docs pages. Lots of resources in there that you can find. If you have questions, feel free to ask them. I intentionally left about 3 minutes of time to ask your questions. I would like you to fill in the feedback page. Tell me what you thought about the session. Tell me what you missed. Tell me what you actually wanted to see. That said, if you have questions, please ask them now. Okay, excellent. You'll need to use the catch box. So while we're waiting for questions, and while Nick is making his way up, the slides, they can be found. Either use the QR code or go to the link. It's basically github.learntospellmyname/presentations, the year, the date, etc. Go ahead.
Yeah, the optimizer that you showed, that's not general availability yet, is it? You still have to select it as a preview feature?
The Optimize ribbon, yes.
Yeah.
The Optimize ribbon is new since November 2022. It is still a preview feature. The good thing is we're not going to wait for a very long time to call it GA. I'm not going to give you a month, but it's going to be soon. Yeah, and there will be new features coming into this.
Yep.
Yep.
Any others?
Go ahead.
Right. Also, under the optimization presets, could we just have a really quick overview of them, please?
Yes. The difference here is that the interactivity, what it does is it allows the standard form of Power BI. Everything interacts with each other. If you set that to query reduction, there's a few things that will happen. The slicer on the top right, you're not going to see it because it's made too small. It's going to have the Apply Slicer button applied to it. Apparently not. Okay, maybe it's hidden. Typically, it has the Applied Slicer button. Let me just open up a different file. The other thing it does is it removes all the interaction between two different visuals. Why do you do that? Typically in those direct query scenarios, when every query interacts with every other query, it's going to generate traffic that you maybe can avoid. What I mean with that Apply Slicer is there's going to be a button like this every single time. What we did since the March release is that you now also have the Apply All Slicers button. So if you put that in there, there's one button to click instead of every single one of these slicers that gets impacted. It's a quick preset. You can still do the same thing that you used to do by going into the options setting, hidden very well where not many people were able to find it. It's just easier to get there. Yep, thank you. We're at time. Thank you so much for being here. Enjoy the rest of Bits.